So Jean, what would you say is needed in order for us to get the contents of that shell moving us again? You know, this relationship with the Lord, which you said, is what molded us, molded Christianity, and which now, in our present day, when we are so superficial about everything, where materialism rules us, where we have no time for this kind of relationship, which is a demanding one, a very challenging one, what would you say should be done to help us to redress this terrible imbalance which has occurred, which is destroying us? What is the new way, in the sense, going back to Cardinal Gretsch, that we should be following, which is not a new way, it's the old way?
Yeah, old and new in the same time. I would say two things first. The first thing is that, okay, let me talk about theology. I know it's very alien and abstract for the majority of the faithful, majority of parishioners. It's like you're talking gibberish and Greek to them. Theology is a science that is in charge of explaining our faith, developing it, presenting it, and so forth. Theology is studied by all future priests. It's mandatory. Of course, you have also philosophy. And it is studied by plenty of more people today, thank God. Lay people can study theology from around Vatican II. It's sort of freed a little bit the thing. So it's not a privilege of the clergy or the religious people consecrated. It's the privilege of whoever wants to study. And even it crosses the borders of the church itself, even of borders of other churches and communities, and even an atheist can study theology. There's no problem there if he or she wants to do that. But what we don't perceive is that how do we make theology? How do we engineer our theology? How do we practice theology? How do we conceive theology? And when you study the history of theology, you find that there are different periods in time in the history of the church, the way the fathers of the church practiced theology, the way the pre-scholastic time practiced theology, the scholastic time, and this is the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas and many others. The way things moved on a little bit, then until a renewal of the beginning of last century occurred, then a huge change happened with what we call the Nouvelle Theologie, new theology, which in fact had a great impact on the Vatican II. So if you study the history of theology, you will find that the way we do theology, the way we practice theology is not always the same. You can't take it for granted. But it is a vital operation here, because people will say, but we have the gospel. Yes, but how do you understand the gospel? That's theology. How to interpret the gospel, how to practice the gospel. This is an in-between operation, which is called theology. Theology is taught from very early. It has different forms also. No? When a father of the church is writing a book like St. Augustine talking about the Trinity, he's practicing theology. You see? Of course, he has his background, philosophical background, then he became Christian, then purified his understanding of certain things, not everything, but still. And then he writes. And when he writes, he is practicing theology. So he is developing, explaining, understanding his own faith. So the mind wants to understand because the mind supports the action. If you don't see, how can you act? We don't measure to which extent sometimes the changes can be extremely fragile. From one form of practicing theology to another form, there are changes, there are movements, and sometimes they overlap. You can have two forms in the same time. We don't measure how this is something that depends on us also. It doesn't depend only on God, it depends on our efforts, and you have more or less quality in these efforts and tendencies that belong to certain periods of the life of the church, the history of the church. We do not measure also the importance, the strategic, utter importance of theology in the church. Theology shaped all the leaders of the church. It shapes on a daily basis, all the leaders of the church. But who chose in which way we will practice theology? You see, that's the question. Now, I personally deeply believe, with all due respect to God, to the Pope, and to the leaders, but I deeply believe that the real leader or the real boss of the church is theology, which means it is the way we understand our faith at a certain moment in time. Because the Pope himself has been formed in a certain way. He belongs to his own place where he's born, where he studied theology, he traveled, he went to another faculty somewhere else, etc. This science that he received, he belongs to it. This is how he understands his faith. You can't ask him to guess something that he hasn't received. What you receive from your university, you take it for granted, unless you are a researcher and you study fundamental theology and you want to challenge some received things. That's fine, you can do that. Research is very important and the church needs that. Some popes can sometimes, of course, be inspired in a clear, powerful way that they can cross certain red lines of the theology that they learn. That's also absolutely possible. I do not negate that. But in order for the rest of the church to receive anything they say, theology has to change and adapt to what they say. And this is life. So, in my humble opinion, theology is an ill body. Ill, tired, sick. It needs to heal, it needs to stand up, and it needs to walk. That's my humble opinion. We are victims of the theology we have today. It has certainly good aspects. We cannot throw the whole thing in the bin. That's not conceivable. We gathered lots of fruits from last century. But I do think that we need to continue the journey on improving theology, because now we sat down and said, okay, we found the way. No, we haven't found the way. We found one step in the way. We still have other steps to do. If you compare the theology in the beginning of last century and the theology developed by the fathers of Council Vatican II, like Congar, Lubac, Balthasar, Rahner, and all the others, this is a nouvelle theology. There is a great step ahead, that's fine, but we stopped there, and I think we have to continue in order to enter in the human being and develop spiritual theology. I just finish, if you allow me, with one point. Spiritual theology is this section of theology that allows us to understand the relationship between the human being and God, human being and Jesus, and how we deal with God and so forth, the journey of spiritual life, of transformation, etc. Spiritual theology till today is a very weak section or part of theology and minor, unfortunately, while in fact it is not minor, it is the one that should be controlling everything. But since it is weak, what I'm saying cannot be understood. If I say that spiritual theology should be the part of theology that controls the entire theology and is capable of renewing it, I'm talking gibberish to the average student in theology or theologian. It did shrink so much that it lost any influence on theology itself, while in fact she is, spiritual theology, the one who can revive the whole thing, because spiritual theology is the part of theology that studies the connection between God and the human being, and by connection I mean the movement of the grace of God. Without the grace of God, without the Holy Spirit, without the communication of God to us, what is Christianity? It's nothing. So if the part of the science that studies the communication between God and us is lost, it's like we live without electricity. Can you live without electricity? Try. Even the heater will not work. The gas heater will not work because you need electricity for it. It is commanded by electricity. Internet is commanded by electricity. So without electricity or fuel, there's nothing. So it's the same thing. Spiritual theology is the path that studies communication, electricity, grace of God, the Holy Spirit. And this part is extremely weakened and challenged, as I had explained in other places. It is still challenged by psychology and by poor exegesis. So the only way in my humbly, the only way to come out of, or to make one good step ahead and continue, would be to renew spiritual theology, but not anyway. This is something that cannot be improvised. That is the other tragic thing. This is how I started my diagnosis. I said the transmission is interrupted. The transmission between my daughter and my past is not possible, because she lives in a world that is totally, utterly fragmented. There is no structure to it. So how can she receive what I'm supposed to give her? She won't be able to receive it. I don't think it's possible. So now coming back to what we were saying, it's the same thing here for spiritual theology. How you cannot improvise spiritual theology. And you have plenty of amateurs or historians of spiritual theology. But this is not what we want. What we want is people who can practice it, which means masters of spiritual life, not just having two ideas that you can put them together. This happened and then that happened. We had that problem in the year, I don't know what, and then this is how they answered. This is history. We don't need history only. We need history, of course, but history alone cannot build a science. That is not history, that is spiritual theology. So again, coming back to the danger I'm mentioning, how can you revive a science if the connection between the past generation is broken? It is broken. I can assure you, it is broken. I read the actual papers and articles that are published. You feel that the writer didn't receive the tradition, this living tradition, not tradition like old-fashioned things. The tradition means the living tradition, the know-how of theology. So he or she cannot transmit spiritual theology. Spiritual theology is not just a knowledge. It's a knowledge, an experience. As Teresa of Avila puts it, no? The master in spiritual life has experience. So he knows what he's talking about. He has understanding, which is science, and he has discernment, capacity to transmit and communicate to others. So with science only, which is the second one, you can't have the first and the third, because it's like, it becomes abstract again. We go back to the same problem we had before, which is we are dealing with an abstract science. Abstract in the sense that it doesn't have connection to God.